So welcome. I thought I'd do a little pre-introduction here. My name is Dane Scott, and I'm the director of the Mansfield Program in Ethics and Public Affairs. Tonight we're talking about geoengineering, this crazy idea to cool down the planet with technological means. And this particular talk is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And we have 3 people working, or at least 4 people working on the grant here. We have Preston and OPI on the grant, and 2 graduate students that have been working on the grant, Andrea Gammon and Wiley Carr. And part of the grant was to increase the ethical dialogue that's going on geoengineering. And so we had a workshop 2 years ago that ended in a special issue of a journal. And Christopher Preston has put together this excellent book on engineering the climate. And we have Christopher edited and brought the book out last year, I believe. And that's a product of the National Science Foundation grant. And so we've got a series of talks here on campus. And tonight we have brought in a couple of speakers that I think Christopher will introduce. And so also the other PI on the grant, Lori Young, is not here tonight. But, thank you for coming. And Christopher Preston, philosophy.
Thanks for coming out everyone tonight. I want to add to what Dane said, that this grant is going on for another year or so, and we're going to do some social science research. Wiley, the graduate student over there, is shortly traveling to some far-off places to interview people on their perceptions about geoengineering. So it's ongoing work. I'm really pleased that Kyle and Marion have come up here to help us with this tonight. Marion nearly didn't make it. She was snowed in Denver. Well, Denver Airport was snowed in yesterday. In the age of global warming, you don't think about snow-caused travel delays. They're just not going to happen. But fortunately, they do happen still. But Marion did make it up here last night. Marion, like I said, lives in Colorado, teaches at Colorado College. She has a philosophy master's degree and a biology master's degree from the University of Montana. So this is kind of a trip back to a place she knows very well. PhD from Duke University. She teaches in environmental ethics and in comparative philosophy, does some Chinese ethics. She has a book in preparation in environmental ethics and an edited book in preparation on ecological restoration in a climate changed world. Kyle teaches philosophy at Michigan State University in East Lansing. As well as being in philosophy, he's an affiliate with American Indian Studies, Environmental Science, and Politics. He is an enrolled member of the Citizen of Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma, PhD from SUNY Stony Brook, does research in climate justice and indigenous peoples. And both Kyle and Marion receive grants and public money from people like the National Science Foundation, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the NEH. So they're both philosophers who sort of reach out and work with scientists and apply their work to some complicated issues in emerging technology. So what we're going to do tonight, I'm going to just do a very brief introduction to geoengineering, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. I'm going to set the ethical context. I'm hopefully going to be done within 10 minutes, looking at my watch right now. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kyle first, who's going to outline his chapter from this book in 15 minutes. Then Marion will outline her chapter in this book for 15 minutes. And then we'll be done, the 3 of us. So hopefully that'll be by 1:15. I have some questions I can pose to them. Maybe I'll start discussion by posing a question each from me. But what I'm hoping is that you'll all then jump in and start asking questions. So that's the plan. We'll see how that goes. So the very brief little introduction to geoengineering and the ethics of geoengineering. I can remember the moment I got interested in geoengineering. It was in front of a diagram like this. Someone was giving a talk, a guy from Yale, Peter Raymond, was giving a talk on the carbon cycle. And I'm sure many of you have seen a schematic like this. And he was talking about the problem with our carbon emissions over there on the right, and emissions through land use changes right here. And he said, it's a really big problem. But then if you were able to just fiddle with some of these numbers, just a little bit, you could solve the global warming problem. So if you could get the ocean, for example, to absorb more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, if you could plant a lot of trees and just get carbon out of the atmosphere, then you would solve the problem. And he made it sound so simple. So I had this sort of momentary epiphany that looked something like this. You know, the Earth works like this. Isn't this fabulous? You twist something there, and something moves over here, and suddenly your problem is solved. So it was a momentary and thoroughly misguided, I should say, epiphany, but it moved me. If you see the global warming problem not as a carbon problem, but as a solar radiation problem, you could have the same kind of discussion about the energy flows on the planet's surface and through the atmosphere. So you sort of see a certain amount of energy coming in from the sun, and then you see a certain amount of energy going out from the sun, and you recognize that the global warming problem is caused by too much of this stuff up here, and so not as much energy exiting as should be, and so things kind of warm up to compensate. And so likewise, if you can mess with some numbers here, if you can bounce a little more energy off of these clouds so that it never arrives, or if you could bounce a little more energy off of the surface so that it never sticks around to heat up the planet, then you just solve the global warming problem. And again, it's great. So, another epiphany sort of moment. This epiphany is a slightly more nervous one, right? Because actually messing with solar energy seems like a pretty big thing to be doing, but it's still a possible epiphany. Here's a slightly complicated diagram which just represents the sorts of things that geoengineers talk about doing. And if you look carefully at the way those things are laid out, they just kind of cast your eyes across that schematic. You'll see that there's some techniques that have SR written after them, and those are techniques that bounce solar radiation away from the planet. And then there's some techniques that have CC next to them, and those are techniques that capture carbon and sequester it. And so you can sort of imagine those two diagrams they had before, the carbon cycle and the solar energy cycle. And you can see that these are geoengineering's attempts to manipulate those variables. And so space mirrors up there would bounce solar energy back out. Whitened clouds would do the same. Aerosols deposited from aircraft or balloons or cannons, they would do the same. You could maybe sequester carbon by creating plankton blooms and sink it to the bottom of the ocean there. You could maybe genetically engineer crops to sequester more carbon in the soil. These are all possible techniques that geoengineers think to embrace. And I'd have to say, pretty exciting, as well as being pretty scary. And Andrew Revkin, a columnist for the New York Times, describes this in a way that I think is appropriate. He says it provides a queasy mix of excitement and unease. So the excitement is, wow, we could solve this. And the unease is, would we really want to mess with the system this much? So a couple of years ago, when we were just getting this grant together, just writing it off, there was a series of books came out. A lot of them were presenting geoengineering as this very exciting kind of prospect. Exciting and a little scary. These two at the front here were written by journalists. This one was written by an environmental historian. And these were just reporting the kinds of things that were in the pipeline that were possible. Towards the end of 2010, this book came out from the Royal Society, which was a little more sober. It was more of a scientific book. But together, these four books really established geoengineering on the map as a serious prospect. At this point, in 2010, there were no books on the ethics of geoengineering, so that's what we set out to do. As Dane mentioned, we've sort of been working hard to get material out there on the ethics of geoengineering. So the book that we published was the first book-length investigation of the ethical issues related to geoengineering. So what are those ethical issues? Once you start sort of investigating geoengineering, there is a whole lot of stuff that's going to come up from an ethical point of view. A real sort of mess of issues. And the book has a representative sample of those issues. Essays in the book include worries about the moral hazard of geoengineering. If you geoengineer, or if you even threaten to geoengineer, then are people going to pay attention to their emissions, or are they just going to forget about emissions? Essays about a slippery slope, like once you start talking about geoengineering, you start researching it, Do you enter a slippery slope that ends up having you committed to geoengineering? There's essays in there about the cultural rhetoric that surrounds discussion of geoengineering. There's essays on the possibility of geoengineering for the public good. Maybe you could geoengineer in a way that was actually good for people and reduced inequity. There's essays on public perceptions. What do people actually think about geoengineering? Is this something people are going to embrace, or is it something people are going to resist? There's essays in there about geoengineering and religion, and maybe the sort of broader cultural and religious contexts that are pertinent to geoengineering. So there's a bunch of stuff in there. Quite a lot of the essays revolve around issues of justice, because quite a lot of the issues in geoengineering revolve around, first, questions of procedure, just procedure, procedural justice. How would you, if you did geoengineer, if you did put reflective mirrors up in space, how would you justly initiate a project like that? Like, who would have to say, yeah, that's okay, I'm on board with that? Who would have to agree to it in order for the procedure to be just? So there's procedural issues with deploying geoengineering. There's actually procedural issues also with researching geoengineering, because there's a certain amount of lock-in and what's called path dependency. Once you get a bunch of people involved in researching an issue, then does that momentum build and sort of the publicity and the rhetoric around something builds such that it becomes more of a priority than it should be if you're hyping the research and if it's sort of the next most exciting thing. So there's procedural justice issues that are very important in geoengineering, and there's also issues in terms of distributive justice. Distributive justice concerns how the benefits and the burdens, because geoengineering is not going to work out well for everybody, how would the benefits and the burdens of geoengineering be spread? And distributive justice, you can think about it in terms of how are those benefits and burdens spread amongst the global population today, but you can also think of it in terms of how those benefits and burdens are spread through time into the future. So it's not just today's population that have interest in the distribution issues of benefits and burdens. It's also future populations. And it's not just populations of humans, it's also the non-human world. So there are concerns about whether geoengineering will also be good for the non-human world. So these issues of distributive and procedural justice loom very large in the book, and they loom very large in the discussion of geoengineering more generally. Now, I have a chapter in the book, and I wanted to just in this one slide, just talk about what that chapter tries to emphasize, tries to bring to our attention. The issues in distributive and procedural justice will be complicated if we all started on a level playing field. If climate change affected all of us equally, those issues of distributive and procedural justice would be complicated. But as you know, it's not the case that climate change affects all of us equally. And so when people talk about the way vulnerabilities are skewed in climate change, this is before any geoengineering has even started, what people talk about are the ways that the vulnerabilities are heavily pitched in a certain direction. So there's people who are particularly geographically vulnerable to climate change. That might be because you live in a very dry region. It might be because you rely upon glacial melt for your drinking water. It might be because you live in the Arctic. But it's something about where you live that makes you particularly vulnerable to climate change. There are people who are economically vulnerable to climate change in that they don't have the economic means to respond easily or adequately to climate change. It so happens that a lot of those people who are economically vulnerable are also geographically vulnerable. There's also a sort of skewing of the justice scales here, because a lot of the people who are both geographically and economically vulnerable are also people who had no involvement in creating a climate change problem in the first place. And so climate change already has this sort of skewed vulnerability concern about justice to it. Now, there is a possibility that geoengineering could make things worse. Now, geoengineering is supposed to help, right? And it will help. It'll help a lot of people. But the exact effects of geoengineering are a little bit uncertain, but it's known that they're going to be uneven. And so it's not clear who exactly will benefit and who exactly will suffer the burden of geoengineering. So when you look at these three justice concerns with climate change, you can start layering on top additional justice concerns with geoengineering. And so some regions will be vulnerable to the uncertainty in geoengineering. We don't know exactly what those regions are, but we know that some things might happen. There's worries about what geoengineering will do to monsoons, for example. Will monsoons become less reliable under an engineered climate? Some of those same people, just as in the first case, are also more economically vulnerable to the uncertainty inherent in geoengineering. Some of those same people are not involved in developing the geoengineering techniques right now. So they are just bystanders. They don't have any say in the types of technologies that are actually being developed. And some of these same people don't have any say or aren't likely to have a strong say in the governance mechanisms. So you've got those three potential injustices through climate change, possibly layered with 4 more injustices through geoengineering. So that makes the justice issues very, very complex. And that's where we're going to start our conversation tonight. Kyle is going to go first and talk about justice issues connected to Indigenous peoples. And then Marion will follow Kyle and talk about her interest in solidarity and how that bears on justice issues. So if you want to come up here, Kyle.
Good evening. How is everybody? That's good. So I first wanted you all to do some hand raising so I could see where some of you all are at. So before tonight, how many of you in the audience had heard of geoengineering? Okay, good. Plenty of you. Another question is, if I were to ask you right now to write down a definition of Indigenous peoples, that is, what does the term Indigenous peoples refer to? How many of you all could probably pull that off? Okay. Good. About half and half, maybe. So geoengineering is definitely going to impact Indigenous peoples everywhere in a variety of ways. Here's how I understand what Indigenous peoples refers to. So Indigenous people are about 370 million people worldwide. And these folks are descendants of pre-invasion inhabitants of lands and geographic regions that are now dominated by nation states, like the US, Canada. So Anishinaabe people in the Great Lakes, Ojibwe, Potawatomi are Indigenous people. Maori in what's now called New Zealand are Indigenous people. These are folks that predate the nation states, which most people assume to be the preeminent sovereigns in the world today. Now, one thing that's particularly important to keep in mind about Indigenous peoples globally is if your society was governing itself for years and years and years and years, and another group invaded you, colonized you, dominated you in some other way, you never consented to that domination. So you retain that sense of sovereignty. You retain that sense that it's up to you to control the lands that you live on. So for Indigenous people today, it's important to remember that even though many people don't acknowledge them as the sovereigns over the territories that they inhabit, and rather talk about Canada or Australia or Ecuador as the sovereign nations, the part of being Indigenous is not only having a unique culture, but having that conception of sovereignty over the territory that matters to you. And even though in my case I primarily work in the Great Lakes region with groups like my own, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa, these issues of sovereignty are very important to Indigenous peoples everywhere, even though the issues that they face are diverse. Now, the problem with geoengineering is if you look at the literature and some of the ideas that are on the table for how to move forward with early research on geoengineering, especially solar radiation management, in those discussions you hardly see Indigenous people mentioned. And when they are, they're just mentioned as stakeholders like anyone else. They're not mentioned as sovereigns in their own territory. And if you really look hard in that literature, you almost get the idea that the people that are interested in testing out geoengineering techniques of all different kinds don't actually think that Indigenous peoples have to consent to it. That is, they think that we could start rolling out research plans for different geoengineering ideas, and you wouldn't have to take the time, put in the effort, or do the hard work to ensure that this is something that Indigenous peoples everywhere might approve of, or might want to take part in, or might want to veto and make sure that it did not happen. And this is the problem that I've been writing about with respect to geoengineering. And there's some serious reasons why this is incredibly wrong. So one thing that folks say when they write about rolling out research plans for geoengineering is that we need to get to it pretty quickly because the climate crisis is a crisis, and geoengineering might be a kind of lesser of two evils solution that will really save all of humanity from what could be a pretty bad future. So that we should start doing research right now to prepare ourselves for what might be a kind of technology that we need to pull on in a time of dire need. And that argument suggests that if you were an Indigenous group and you were worried about how you might be affected by a geoengineering project, that for you to even dare to try to veto that and suggest that it was inconsistent with your worldview, that you're worried about the negative impacts on the environment that matters to your community members, that where you'd even dare to go there, that you would be putting your own society in front of all of humanity. So there's this argument that geoengineering is about saving possibly all of humanity from really bad fate, so that anybody who might say, no, let's not do it, no, let's slow down and go through a consent process, is being just incredibly selfish or ethnocentric to their particular community. What I want to argue is that this problem, or that this kind of argument that's made is problematic, and one of the first reasons why is that it's entirely inconsistent with the progress that we've made on Indigenous peoples' international governance over the last 40 years. So when anybody writes about rolling out plans, and they mention sovereigns like the United States or Australia, but they don't mention Indigenous peoples as sovereigns, they're violating this progress that we've made. In international law, it's now a given that Indigenous peoples represent a kind of sovereign that deserves a place at the table with other sovereigns. So Indigenous peoples are governments and should have that same respect that governments like the United States or Australia have. So you can't say, oh, we're going to roll out plans that might affect Indigenous territories and talk about governments of nation states and not talk about governments of Indigenous peoples. So that any literature like the one on geoengineering that doesn't mention Indigenous people specifically as sovereigns has no right to say that it's okay for the plans to roll out without Indigenous people's consent. They're going against the progress that we've been making over the last 40 years in Indigenous sovereignty having a kind of respect. Another thing that's part of the international movement, especially the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which the United States has acknowledged, is free, prior, and informed consent. If somebody wants to do anything that's going to affect Indigenous people's lands, and it's especially going to compromise the cultural and subsistence significance of those lands, then the people who are going to be affected have to give their free, so not coerced or exploited, prior, it's got to be as early as possible, and informed, they were involved in information about what's really going to happen, consent to that. And I haven't seen in any of the literature, any of the ideas on geoengineering about how to roll out early research that the Indigenous groups that might be affected are going to have the opportunity to give their free, prior, and informed consent. And that's now the norm for working with Indigenous people. Another reason having to do with the international movement on Indigenous people is that now it's acknowledged that Indigenous legal systems and Indigenous systems of negotiation, that these should be also respected just as much as the legal systems of nation states. So for example, if I'm going to roll out geoengineering plans in an Indigenous nation or that's going to affect Indigenous nation, I can't just say that, oh, the nation state that Indigenous territory within, I can just follow their laws and their procedures for doing research. I also would have to comply with the customs, the laws, the legal systems of that Indigenous group as well, even if that system differs greatly from a Western legal system. So anybody who talks about rolling out geoengineering plans and doesn't specifically address the issue that they're going to need to engage directly with uniquely Indigenous legal systems is also extremely behind the times. So what I see with a lot of geoengineering is I see folks who are trying to roll out plans and who say, oh, it's okay for Indigenous people not to consent because the need is dire, but they're doing it in a way that ignores the progress we've made in joint international governance between nation states and Indigenous peoples that respect Indigenous peoples' sovereignty, their free, prior, and informed consent, and the right of Indigenous people to use and apply their own customary legal practices. So that geoengineering is only going to be acceptable if the people that want to roll out the research plans then fall in line with the progress that's been made on international Indigenous governance. So this is extremely important issue, and one that in a lot of ways makes it so that we shouldn't engage in geoengineering as it has been articulated right now until this is absolutely fixed. Another reason I wanted to talk about that particularly disturbs me is the folks who write about geoengineering plans. You know, they often make this case that, yeah, you know, people who dissent they're folks that are scared about the fact that geoengineering might be like past technologies that harmed people. You know, past technologies where the engineers said this is an amazing idea. You know, don't worry about it. This is for the good of all, and then it really hurt some people very badly. And the engineers, the technologists who were part of it just had to say, sorry, we didn't know, we did our best to assess things. And so because there's uncertainties bound up with geoengineering, a lot of the advocates for beginning to think about rolling out early research say that folks that initially dissent to it are simply caught up in those old patterns of thinking. But you know, the issue for a lot of Indigenous peoples is that the arguments that you hear that are advocating for getting into pursuing geoengineering, they sound a lot like the arguments that people have used for years to convince Indigenous peoples that they should accept new technologies. So take, for example, in this region, something that a lot of Indigenous folks are familiar with, the dam projects. You know, the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, suggested all sorts of crazy things about how Indigenous people should let the dams come in, they shouldn't dissent against the dams, and so on. Even though the dams were going to flood Indigenous communities, they were going to threaten fish populations and numerous other things, but they were told that the dams are just a lesser of two evils. They're the good for the entire region. So that even if a few Indigenous people are harmed, that's just the price of progress. And some Indigenous people were even persuaded that the fish that they valued would be able to swim through the turbines and would still be able to survive, that technology could fix things. So Indigenous people have heard this argument before, that a technology is for the good of humanity and that Indigenous people should just be sacrificed for it. But the problem is that argument is never a genuine argument. It's always an argument that's used to suggest that it's okay to bypass Indigenous people's sovereignty, that it's okay for non-Indigenous people to articulate the plans and the worldviews that Indigenous people should conform to. It's never an argument that genuinely says that people truly feel that the technology is going to pose no risk to Indigenous people. It's an argument that apologizes for a world we live in now where non-Indigenous people are privileged in ways that they make decisions for Indigenous people and the Indigenous peoples must react to. So for anybody who thinks that it's okay to suggest that geoengineering is a lesser of two evils that Indigenous people should simply accept without having to consent, they need to realize that if Indigenous people are ever going to participate meaningfully in this process, they need to change their argument. They need to realize that because it's the same old argument that we've heard time and again about Indigenous people, that it's their responsibility to say something different. It's their responsibility to come clean and give a sober reality check about what geoengineering really might entail for Indigenous people, and to respect those emerging international norms of Indigenous sovereignty, free, prior, informed consent, and Indigenous customary law. Until this happens, we definitely should not entertain moving forward, even with early research, on a lot of forms of geoengineering.
All right. So the issues I want to talk about involve questions of justice, but what I'm most interested in is thinking about how geoengineering, and specifically solar radiation management, might affect, either positively or negatively, the conditions that make it possible for us to realize climate justice. So I'll explain that as we go. So I'm going to start off with a couple of assumptions that I think are relatively uncontroversial. I'm not going to argue for these. If we ask the question, what would an ethical response to climate change look like? I think there's a fairly wide consensus that the best response, ethically speaking, would minimize harm to humans, animals, plants, and ecosystems, and would fairly distribute responsibility for mitigation and adaptation with respect to climate change. And with respect to that latter point, fairly distributing responsibility, a fair distribution is going to have to take into account both past and present contributions to the problem of global climate change, as well as the capacity to pay. So that means that nations, if we're going to talk about nations, as bearers of moral responsibility, then nations that have contributed more or are contributing more will have greater responsibility than those that contribute less, and those that have a greater capacity to pay similarly have a greater responsibility to both engage in mitigation and help with adaptation. Now, unsurprisingly, that points some large arrows toward industrialized, developed nations like the United States. So in the long term, an ethical response to climate change is going to require a substantial reduction in the concentration of atmospheric greenhouse gases, and we in the US and those others who are similarly positioned need to bear a substantial amount of that responsibility. It's also going to require adaptation to a changing climate, because at this point we're committed to an altered climate based on time lags and what we've already, the greenhouse gases that we've already added to the atmosphere. And if we're thinking about adaptation, I think a just system of adaptation is going to have to be one that provides assistance to those who are most vulnerable and least able to adapt. So the question I want us to think about in the next few minutes is what sorts of conditions might enable us to achieve this kind of response that I've outlined, where we are able to develop a just response to the climate issues we face. Okay, I also want to back up a little bit and put geoengineering in some kind of context. When people, governments especially, first started seriously talking and thinking about climate change, the focus was strongly on mitigation. And mitigation understood as reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by reducing emissions. Then as mitigation, the sort of discussions hummed along, but not much happened, people started talking about adaptation. Well, we're going to have to actually do something to adjust to the fact that the climate's going to change. We're not going to be able to mitigate the problem away. And then more recently, geoengineering, this has entered the scene as a sort of third way, yet another alternative in this triad of responses to climate change. And the case for geoengineering, I think, the sort of standard case for geoengineering has been already alluded to in some of what we've heard, but one of the basic arguments is that mitigation is not working. We've been unsuccessful in coming up with any kind of really genuinely powerful international agreement that's going to move us to where we need to be to avert serious climate change. And adaptation isn't going to be enough. We can't just, build our way, say, out of climate change. So we need geoengineering. Geoengineering can help us buy time, and it's a justified response to our current climate emergency. And the idea here is that Plan A, or plans A and B, perhaps, have failed, and we need Plan B or C, depending on how you see it. And Christopher has already suggested and outlined the fact that there are two main approaches: carbon dioxide removal, which pulls carbon out of the atmosphere in various ways. I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about is solar radiation management. What I specifically have in mind are large-scale global schemes to inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect increasing amounts of solar radiation back into space. Okay. So there are a lot of, despite this argument for geoengineering, there are a lot of ethical concerns, and there are a lot of arguments against geoengineering. Some of those arguments focus on unintended environmental effects, which potentially could be serious. So changes in monsoonal rains, Christopher mentioned. There potentially could be also exacerbation of damage to the ozone layer, stratospheric ozone. There will be, I think people are pretty confident that about rebound effects. If we start geoengineering via solar radiation management, but we continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, then the climate forcing from greenhouse gases is continuing to go up, and we're kind of masking that effect with solar radiation management. So when you take off the mask, all of a sudden, all that climate forcing has accumulated, and there could be pretty serious, catastrophic climate rebound effects. SRM, solar radiation management, also does nothing about the problem of ocean acidification, because it does nothing to reduce CO2, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And then there are all these problems that are more social in nature, having to do with the fact that we don't have a good global governance regime for this kind of large-scale geoengineering project. If we go ahead with it, there's a likelihood that the incentive to mitigate emissions, reduce emissions, may decline. And then there's kind of a fundamental objection that this is human domination of nature, and as such is inherently wrong. So that's just kind of a review of some of the main arguments that people are making against geoengineering. And I want to add one more, or at least raise one more set of ethical concerns. So I think very clearly the side effects of geoengineering, direct effects on the physical environment matter. I think that the concern about human domination is one we should be thinking about and talking about. But I want to raise an issue that has something more to do with the concerns about how geoengineering and the social environment, so maybe how the natural environment or our manipulation of it, and the social environment might interact, and how that will affect our capacity to come up with a just solution or just response to climate change. So I'm concerned with some of the indirect effects of geoengineering, such as our likely effects on our moral relations with one another, and the future choices we make with respect to climate change. So how might SRM affect our understanding of and our approaches to climate change? Christopher suggested that in watching this presentation by a scientist on the carbon cycle, he was prompted to kind of think of the climate problem as a carbon problem, right? And if you just, turn this gear, manipulate this lever, then problem solved. One worry that I have is just that geoengineering might encourage us to think about climate change as a technical problem and perhaps not see some of its other important dimensions. And I think that what I want to suggest is that geoengineering is not just a technological experiment. It's not just a natural science experiment with the planet. It's also, as Phil McNaughton suggested in a recent paper, a global social experiment. And the effects of failed social experiments, I want to suggest, can be just as bad as the side effects or unanticipated consequences of failed technological experiments. Okay, so the basic argument I want to make is that if we are going to achieve a just response to the problem of global climate change, then we are going to need relationships of moral solidarity, trust, and reciprocity. If you think about climate change as a large-scale collective action problem, a kind of global tragedy of the commons, then I think there's a good argument to be made that we'll be less successful in solving this kind of problem if we lack solidarity, trust, and reciprocity. And I think that large-scale SRM threatens the establishment and maintenance of moral relationships that are going to be crucial in solving the problem. Okay, so I want to say something just briefly about what's the way I understand or think about solidarity and why solidarity might matter. There are a number of different ways that people have thought about solidarity. A common way of thinking about solidarity is in terms of wholeness or cohesion. I think some of the more helpful recent literature on solidarity emphasizes the idea of solidarity as a form of social empathy. And also, I think some of the most helpful literature focuses on relationships of moral solidarity. So I'm wanting us to think about what kind of moral relationship we have to one another, not just like here in this room or on the University of Montana campus or in this state, but what kinds of moral relationships do we stand in with others on the other side of the world? Why does solidarity matter? I think really for two reasons. One, I think solidarity is something like a form of social capital that enables us to think about large-scale problems and conceptualize them as problems for all of us, that each of us, that we all need to face together. And then I also believe, but I can't argue in detail for it here, that solidarity is actually partly constitutive of good moral relationships among people. Okay. So how does this all relate back to geoengineering? I think that SRM geoengineering endangers solidarity in three central ways. One is by diffusing focus and attention away from global mitigation agreements. Two, by creating divisions within generations. And three, by creating divisions between generations. So I'll say something just briefly about each of those. Okay, so SRM will be resource intensive, and by that I mean not just that it's going to cost money. It will cost money, and I read recently in the paper that there's some discussion in the Obama administration about how to allocate the budget for research on climate change. How much, and part of the discussion was how much money should go to geoengineering versus other aspects of the climate challenge. So there's going to be, there's a sense in which it'll be resource intensive financially, but I also want to suggest that if we're going to go forward with SRM, we're going to go forward in a way that's at all ethically defensible, we're going to have to spend a lot of time talking to one another, thinking about issues like consent, and working out some kind of arrangement that could be considered procedurally just. That is not a simple process. If we spend a lot of time and energy doing that, that's time and energy that we're not spending necessarily building a global agreement on mitigation. And if conflicts arise during those processes, they could undermine our ability to make progress on mitigation. There's also this problem of reducing the perceived urgency of climate change. So a lot of people have talked about this, but Elke Weber has argued that we are prone to something called single action bias. So if we're faced with a problem and we do one thing about it, even if that one thing is not sufficient to overcome or fully address the problem, we think, well, we've addressed the problem, we've responded to it. I think we would be seriously mistaken in thinking that by throwing putting some aerosols into the stratosphere, we've addressed the problem of climate change. Okay, what about divisions within generations? My worry here is that solidarity is going to be negatively affected by increasing inequity. So again, Christopher talked about the kind of compounding inequity of that geoengineering poses. There are likely to be uneven effects sort of on the natural environment, and some of these effects, like effects on monsoons, are going to be felt by some of the people who are already most vulnerable and least well positioned to deal with climate change. There is already, I would argue, inequitable control of research and development of geoengineering strategies. And as we start to move forward with geoengineering, new actors, people who have, say, financial interests in the development of geoengineering schemes are going to be involved. That creates kind of new incentives and incentives that aren't necessarily aligned with the best interests of all people across the world. So these inequities in turn can undermine solidarity by undermining the basis for trust and common purpose, and can reduce our sense of shared vulnerability. Okay. Now these divisions within generations actually have effects, I would argue, between generations, because future generations are dependent on what we do now with respect to climate change. So if we don't, what we should be doing, arguably, from an ethical perspective, is putting into place, engaging in mitigation and putting into place the infrastructure and the institutions that will be needed to cope with this problem. If instead we devolve into factionalization and dispute, then we'll in turn hand future generations a worse climate and a worse situation, fewer options for dealing with the problem. I also think that solar radiation management may directly reduce our solidarity with future generations. And I'll focus on just one thing in this respect. Specifically, I'll focus on this idea of the global thermostat. So when you read the literature on geoengineering, often people talk about this idea of the global thermostat. And this often comes up with respect to questions of justice and questions of disparate interests of different people across the globe. And so the question that people raise is, who gets to set the global thermostat, right? Is it the US that gets to decide, this is a nice temperature for us, we're pretty cozy here, or is it an alliance of countries in Africa? Is it China? Who gets to decide? Those are important questions, but what I want to do is suggest that the global thermostat analogy itself is problematic. What it suggests is that all we have to do is walk over here and we can just kick the temperature up a few degrees or down a few degrees. And it suggests that climate change is not only a technical problem, but one that can be sort of where we can just kind of modulate the global climate with the turn of a dial. So I'm worried about that analogy, and more broadly, I'm worried about the idea that SRM may encourage us to see climate change as a technical problem rather than a social, economic, political, institutional, infrastructural, behavioral, and ethical problem. That it may cause us to think about climate change as a local problem rather than a global problem, and there's beginning to be more work on this. And that if we're thinking about setting the global thermostat and thinking about geoengineering as a solution to climate change, we are tempted, I think, more and more to think about climate change as exclusively a human problem rather than a problem for animals, plants, and ecological communities more generally. Okay, so this is just to suggest what I've just described, that there are feedback effects between the ways that we frame a problem like global climate change and what we do about it. So if we frame it as a technical problem, we'll be more likely to geoengineer. If we geoengineer, we'll be more likely to see it as a technical problem. Okay. So to conclude, I want to suggest that in thinking about climate change, we shouldn't forget about the way in which our relationships with one another affect our capacity to respond justly to this problem. And that I think the best chance of developing a just response is going to depend on our thinking about ourselves as an interdependent global community. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So I'm gonna throw one question each to Kyle and Marion. And I did warn them beforehand that they would be a little bit obnoxious. Not necessarily representing my view, but views that I have heard. And so, as I ask these couple of questions, you get ready for your questions next. So, Kyle, I think I'll ask you first. I was going to ask you, should there be any research proceeding now? But you gave a pretty unequivocal answer to that. So, what I'm going to do is move on to, you said no, there should be no geoengineering research at the moment. So, I'm going to move on to sort of a follow-up for that. A lot of the people who we see advocating geoengineering research, when you read articles or look at listservs and discussion groups, the advocates suggest that neither indigenous nor non-indigenous people know quite how much trouble they're in. If they knew how much trouble they were in through climate change, they would be quite okay with us researching this stuff. How would you respond to that?
So, sorry, are you sure that's not your view? Well, so what I'm actually curious, first, just to put a question back to you is, so, I mean, generally speaking, not in specifics, but who are these folks that you're talking about who are writing this stuff? Are these journalists and commentators or scientists or?
Geoengineering researchers, scientists, people in the Google group who, I don't know if you keep your eye on that, but yeah.
So let's talk about a scenario in which everybody in the planet actually found out for a fact and in advance that they were in such bad trouble that the only option was some form of geoengineering. So we can just say that that's the fact, that's the scenario that's occurred. Do any of the issues that I talked about go away? Because say that that's the case, and say that it has to happen rapidly, and say that that means that the sort of consent processes that are required now and that are emerging for Indigenous people just couldn't be fulfilled, and somebody's to say, oh, well, Indigenous people are just going to have to be sacrificed. And that's just the bad luck of the situation. And that always gets invoked. And the problem is that we've had 500 years of bad luck. You know, it's like every single doggone time that something like this comes up, whether it's regionally or globally, folks always act like it's the latest idea to suggest that this time around Indigenous people will be sacrificed as the plans go through. But that's been the norm. That's not the exception. So even if we did have that case where everybody was definitely going to go for some kind of geoengineering and roll it out. None of the stuff I said is irrelevant. Now, here's another thing too. There's definitely a difference in the Indigenous, non-Indigenous discourses on geoengineering. So in a non-Indigenous discourse, one of the ideas that you hear a lot is that now we've come to this point in time where we're thinking about humans, controlling the environment, manipulating the climate system. But for Indigenous people, the idea that humans play a heavy hand in managing and stewarding the environment, I mean, that's nothing new. In fact, it's precisely that conversation that Indigenous peoples have had for, hundreds, even thousands of years has been suppressed by white people, essentially, right? The idea that humans are intimately entangled with non-human species and natural systems. So it's not that Indigenous people are necessarily horrified and aghast at the idea of geoengineering. It's a pretty common sense idea. People deal with the environment. People can control and exercise certain stewardship over the environment. So the issue is not that geoengineering is something revolting, but the idea is that anybody who advocates it, if they're still in that mode of thinking where they're like, here are our plans, now let's figure out ways to persuade Indigenous people how they can be part of those plans. So a lot of geoengineering researchers say stuff like, oh, well, I know this one token example where we were doing some kind of research that's relevant to geoengineering. It's of an analogous nature, so we could use it as an example for thinking about what geoengineering research would look like. It was great that the tribes that were in that area, they got to contribute their traditional ecological knowledge to the research, or they got to be part of a co-management board where we all got to make joint decisions and so on, or they got to have some other privilege. But that's what all these folks are doing. They're saying these are the plans and this is how Indigenous people are going to fit into these plans. But if you ask a lot of Indigenous folks, is this what you really want out of the situation? It's not the case, right? From an Indigenous perspective, what needs to happen is that folks need to be involved at the conceptual level. So at that conceptual level, when people are thinking climate change is that bad, we've got to geoengineer. What does geoengineering mean? That's where Indigenous people need to be involved. That's the conceptual level. It's not, here's all the options to do geoengineering, how do Indigenous people get involved? Free, prior, and informed consent means conceptual involvement. That's what the prior means. The prior doesn't mean, right after we've laid out the options. It means in the process of developing what the options are. So I think that the argument that you're making, which is not your own argument, of course, right? It not only doesn't bypass the concerns that I'm raising, I think it actually deepens them. And were that the case, I would be even more adamant that what I'm saying is critical.
Yeah. Okay, Marion, it's your turn.
Okay.
You suggested that climate change problems require trust, solidarity, and reciprocity to be solved ethically. What do you say to somebody who says what they really require to be solved at all is self-interest?
Self-interest?
Yeah.
Well, I guess, okay. Solidarity, there's a sense in which solidarity involves everyone's interests, but it's not a narrow sense of self-interest. And I guess what I would say is that there's a reasonable amount of good empirical work suggesting that self-interest is kind of a fragile basis for developing ethical solutions to collective action problems. And I've argued elsewhere that one of the problems, one of the reasons we face certain collective action problems, or one of the reasons those problems become so acute, is because we have kind of a narrow and truncated sense of self and self-interest, which I think is actually reinforced by economic models that suggest that humans are sort of fundamentally and essentially rational economic actors who seek their own self-interest. So, this is the kind of logic that suggests that, it would be irrational for me to reduce my individual contributions to climate change by, say, biking to work, because everyone wants to use as much of the global commons as possible. Everyone wants to use as many, produce as many greenhouse gases as possible. So if I bike, then that means the price of gas will go down and more people, Christopher gets to go on an extra ski trip or something like that. So, and he just says, thanks, sucker, and I think there are actually, Elinor Ostrom, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, well, she's sort of an economist, social scientist. I'm not sure, she's not a traditional economist, but she won the Nobel Prize in economics. She's done a lot of interesting work suggesting that the kind of Garrett Hardin tragedy, the commons model, is, as all models are, a simplification, but also a simplification that can be misleading. She's found that in many communities, people work out ways to solve collective action problems that wouldn't be predicted by the kind of homo economicus rational actor model. So my suggestion is that, and she's also found that, when people, one of the things that sort of is a difference maker between sort of going into a full-on tragedy of the commons and averting that tragedy is the presence of something like trust, a sense of reciprocity and communication among people who are differently situated in the community and the development of collective norms. So I think it's for that reason that I think that self-interest alone is not really going to get us where we need to go.
Okay. Russ?
Your comments about the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples were eye-opening for me. I'm wondering how many Indigenous groups there are that have sovereignty in the world, and how you see the structure of global governance or the negotiation for specific proposals for dealing with these issues.
So that's a tough question. When you say, Indigenous people have sovereignty, right? So there's a couple ways to think about that, and I'll give you the idea of the complexity of it by just focusing on the United States, and I'll suggest it's even more complicated in a lot of other areas. So in the U.S., there's about 565 tribes that the federal government of the United States recognizes as sovereigns, as a third sovereign in addition to states and the federal government. There is about 100 tribes that are not recognized by the federal government, but recognized by state governments. Then there are a whole host of tribes that the state or the federal government doesn't recognize. Now, within some of these distinctions, there's also tribes like in California that don't have ratified treaties. There's tribes that are considered sovereign by the federal government but don't have reservations or don't have a land base. There's a bunch of tribes in some cases that are all squeezed onto the same reservation. They might not have gotten along historically, but the U.S. government plopped them down there. There are Alaska Natives, which also their status in the eyes of the federal government comes from the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and not always the Indian Reorganization Act in the same way that it is for tribes in the lower 48. And there's even more distinctions to this, right? Oklahoma has its own Indian Reorganization Act. It's different from the federal act. So we can keep going through all of these different distinctions to suggest that if you're talking about sovereignty in terms of who do non-native, non-indigenous people think is sovereign, it's extremely complex. In a lot of international discussions between North American and South American indigenous people, tribes, tribes like where I'm from, talk regularly about upholding sovereignty and so on. But in South America, some folks are like, well, we're never going to be respected as sovereigns, and we're more concerned with being tortured by the police or having some of these basic rights violated. So oftentimes it's hard to converse across regions because of the different respect or disrespect accorded to sovereignty. Now, what I'd say for a lot of indigenous folks is not everyone uses the term sovereignty or self-determination. Not everyone uses it in the same way. But what I think does bring together for conversation a lot of indigenous folks is this idea that your parents, grandparents, all the way back didn't consent to domination by Ecuador or by Spain or by the United States. And that sense of self-determination is not something you can simply ignore. It's a sense that those nation states are not legitimate. It's a deeply felt sense. It's not just an intellectual critique of the artificiality of the nation state. So if you look at the sort of thousands of indigenous people, you're going to find all sorts of different levels of respect accorded to them by the powers that they have to deal with. But I think for most of them, you're definitely almost always going to find a sense of self-determination that manifests from that sense of coming before the current system of power. So that's the best answer I can give you on that. And then you asked me a question about what it would look like for indigenous, non-indigenous groups to come together internationally. What I definitely can tell you about that is some conversations that definitely need to occur. So one of the things that people ignore is they might say, okay, well, indigenous people ought to be considered as a kind of sovereign alongside nation states, so there should be agreements and plans and policies and so on. But oftentimes people forget that the processes by which sovereigns are supposed to engage each other are oftentimes not determined by indigenous people. And indigenous people have their own ideas about how to negotiate, how to engage in diplomacy, how to engage in consent, right? So for example, a lot of folks in the Great Lakes I work with, especially on the Haudenosaunee side, use what's called the Way of Peace. That's a specific negotiation planning management process in which indigenous, non-indigenous people can engage. And one thing to note is that a lot of indigenous strategies for negotiation, diplomacy, and consent are ones that build in a strong sense that you're working across the table with people who are very different from you and who should remain independent. Whereas a lot of non-indigenous forms don't keep that sense of independence of all the parties that are at the table. So a definite conversation that actually needs to happen is that the processes now need to be indigenized. That is, the processes by which sovereigns might work together and collaborate around something like geoengineering need also to be inclusive of indigenous ways of doing that. And that's just a conversation that's not had enough. And before we have that conversation, we can't even address some of the ultimate questions that you're asking.
What would be a specific example for how geoengineering would negatively affect indigenous people?
So I think a good general example to think about, which can refer to a number of specifics, is that if geoengineering is going to affect the climate system, and effects on the climate system are going to have local implications. They're going to affect water, precipitation, the shifts in populations of species. And for indigenous peoples, they have extraordinarily intimate relations with the environment. So that being able, for example, to track a species that is culturally significant for an indigenous people is crucial for existence. It's of intrinsic value to indigenous people, right? I was talking a lot earlier today about that for a lot of North American tribal communities, the way you relate to animals is like you'd relate to another human population. There's a spiritual relationship, and it's not only based on material subsistence. So this idea that indigenous people are very closely acquainted with the environment and very sensitive to the environment around them means that anybody who proposes something that would affect the environment in some way is indigenous business. Even if it's one that, say, wouldn't lead to a natural disaster, but would just lead to some kind of shift, that's going to deeply affect an indigenous group that might depend on that species or might depend on certain patterns manifest from a natural system. So I think you'll find is that the answer to your question is indigenous people are concerned with any of the effects of climate change, and geoengineering as an intervention into the climate system can have all of those implications. And so that's for some kinds of geoengineering, but these other kinds of geoengineering, like creating carbon sinks and things like that, so that also presents other issues, like, for example, for a lot of indigenous people that depend on forests, they see that there are conflicts between the sort of forest that they want to maintain and the kind of forest that's ideal as a carbon sink. And so this creates a lot of conflict because they feel as though those advocates of carbon markets that want to turn forests into carbon sinks, they're actually trying to colonize indigenous systems of forest stewardship. So a lot of indigenous people are not just, are concerned about some of the policy implications on the environment of certain kinds of geoengineering.
As you were, Kyle was in my class today, so this is part of an ongoing conversation. It's a statement with a question at the end about the two of you. One of the things that strikes me between your two talks, they're inextricably linked by the idea of discourse. And the idea that commons or ideas that have to do with sacrifice and who pays the price of sacrifice have been with us a long, long time. And indigenous people have paid a price, but they haven't paid it by themselves. We are living in a culture of incredibly toxic masculinity, for example. And we're coming at it like a bully kind of mentality that is public in an ugly way, in my opinion. And it strikes me that if you don't shift the discourse, you can't shift the science. It isn't about data or, so what you said earlier today about traditional ecological knowledge is not just about getting knowledge from indigenous people about how to do it. It's about the system of responsibility and how you create almost a kind of listening, and that listening is a reciprocity that is necessary to go forward in a just way. So you can probably intuit my question that Marion's ideas about the justices or the issues of justice and how indigenous people are central to that, not peripheral like as in the past. And can you address that?
Well, I think it's a nice connection that you're making between the talks, and I do think this issue of discourse is important. I mean, Christopher just mentioned the geoengineering Google Groups discussion, which all of you can sign up for and follow if you so choose. And I've actually been really concerned about the nature of the discourse there, and I think it speaks to some of the concerns that you have about kind of marginalization of diverse perspectives. I think Kyle's absolutely right that people aren't even really thinking about or at all trying to take seriously indigenous perspectives. But I also think that even ethical considerations at all are being marginalized in some of the scientific discussions, and in a kind of scary way. And so, I mean, maybe I shouldn't name names. I don't know if I should. But I mean, there are some prominent scientists who are suggesting that really that the ethical considerations that are being raised surrounding geoengineering are simply obstacles to their efforts to save the planet. And I think this was expressed maybe most acutely like in the last week or two when somebody posted a paper on issues of compensation for people who were who potentially would be negatively impacted by the side effects of geoengineering. So could we develop some kind of compensation scheme for indigenous peoples or for people in India whose farming practices would be disrupted or something like that? And one of the scientists responded by saying, well, how about like compensation for like planet-saving scientists on a limited budget? Like, what about us? Like, you know, basically, we're the knights on white horses. And I actually think that that many of these scientists are very well-intentioned. I mean, I have a background in science, so I don't want to at all malign scientists generally, but I think there's a sense in which the discourse is such that there's a disconnect. There's like a lack of recognition of the concerns, many of the concerns that are being raised, and I think that is connected with some of the issues that Kyle is raising, because I mean, there are these, one of the points that people have made in relation to justice, I think there's been increasing discussion of this problem of recognition, that there's not uptake, and there's a sense in which, I think, just as Kyle was suggesting, that often the way certain discourses are set up make it the case that you can kind of adopt the framework and participate in the discourse on those terms, or your perspective can't really be heard or taken up. So yeah, I think these issues are very much connected.
The scientists that talked about the shoestring budget, they should go to Indian country and they should see.
That's right.
They should talk shoestrings. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just briefly, I mean, one of the, I think that the indigenous, the global indigenous movements are oftentimes a lot stronger when they're tied to other movements, when they're tied to feminist movements, when they're tied to movements addressing economic exploitation, movements tied to the issues and experiences of people with disabilities. And one of the criticisms I do have of policies like the UNDRIP, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, is they don't really cover rights to network. I mean, kind of like in your work, you form solidarity. And what oftentimes is truly marginalized is the ability of not only Indigenous people to reach out among themselves, but then to reach out to all of these other groups in which communication and sharing needs to occur to be able to address some of the problems that we've talked about today. And I think that Native people and all sorts of other people really do have a right to network. And we can see in some cases the power of networks to address a lot of problems. And this discussion on geoengineering completely ignores that. And I think that Marion's presentation brings out a particular angle of that issue and why it's particularly pressing.
I have a lot of strong ideas and opinions about geoengineering. I guess what I'd like to share with everyone to get people's thoughts on tonight. I just ordered a few things down, so I'm just going to read those and just kind of put that out there for people to think about. I think that geoengineering is a totally insane solution that's coming out of a completely insane culture. I would propose that the best solution to global climate change is not drastic, unfounded, potentially catastrophic injections of various compounds into the atmosphere, into the oceans, genetically modified food, massive reflective panels, but rather a global resistance movement to the very mechanisms of civilization that have brought the planet to the state of ecological freefall that we find ourselves in now. It seems to me that we know what works. We know that making the problem worse won't work. We know that reducing carbon emissions, reducing CO2, reducing methane, reducing other toxins into the atmosphere and our waterways, etc., is something that would help the situation. And I know, and I say that recognizing that no matter what, the planet is going to change drastically because of human actions, because of climate change. I mean, we're talking about 50% of the permanent ice in the Arctic gone in the last 30 years. We're talking about 100% of the surface ice of Greenland melting in 4 days, less than 4 days actually in 2012. We're talking about scientists predicting that by 2016, we're not going to have any ice in the Arctic over the summer months, just to start with. We have Dutch Royal Shell spending $5 billion developing technology to exploit those resources that are going to be uncovered, because it's going to happen. So I don't say that this is insane and it shouldn't be done, because I don't recognize how horrible the situation is. And I just think it's the best proposal right now, based on that, based on the things I've kind of talked about, the concerns I have, is to draw down the very technologies that are putting us into this position, to look at ways of doing the things that we already know how to do that make sense, to have a real global resistance movement. I think that anything else, in light of human arrogance, in light of how many times we failed, to do things properly, how much damage we've already caused, to even be talking about this is insane. And we can look to indigenous cultures, the traditions and the relationship to the land that they've managed to hold on to and still celebrate in some areas, despite genocide, despite being victims of the civilization that has largely destroyed a lot of their ability to live on their land base in a way that makes sense, in a way that's in a harmonious relationship with the planet. And we can look to them and say, those are solutions. Having a relationship to the earth that you view it as something that's sacred, not to be destroyed, could be a solution to climate change. But we're not doing that. We're again cloaking, we're letting scientists at the top kind of talk about these esoteric, terribly frightening ideas, maybe already implementing them in ways that we're not aware of and don't see and don't know, because the media is not telling us. The media is hiding things from people. So to say we haven't been able to come up with solutions or mitigations, I think is false. The people haven't really been given a voice. Indigenous people haven't been given a voice on how to deal with this. Corporations have gone to meetings. Corporations and governments have worked together to figure out, 2 degrees Celsius is a safe number. That's not really mitigation. That's not really incorporating anybody's voices, and that's how I feel about that. And I think if we're going to be serious about this, that we do need a resistance movement of such magnitude and scale that we can bring this entire system to its knees and save the planet and adapt what we can and not make matters worse. So thank you.
Here. Yeah. That's right.
Any thoughts from the panel or the audience? I'm interested in everybody, not just the experts, because we're all people on this planet. And, I'm speaking for not just myself and humans, but the rest of the biotic kingdom that can't be here and speak for themselves. We're using 200 species a day.
Did you want, the gentleman beside you, I think, wanted to, do you want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, I think we need to kind of change the rhetoric and the way that we frame this argument, because really we're all indigenous sovereigns to Earth. We're all human beings living here. It's not an argument of whether it's, indigenous people have power to make this change. We are using this rhetoric because we're not taking responsibility for the way that we are consuming the technologies that are already here. Okay, so I feel that we need to reframe this argument because we didn't give informed consent in the womb. We didn't for these technologies that are here already. So I think that is the way the argument needs to be framed.
Okay. Anyone want to respond to that?
I just have a question for you guys. So while we are having these discussions about the indigenous people and about moral justice and everything, in the meantime, because things are, as we said before, they're moving fairly quickly. I mean, global warming is not exactly moving slow. Is there anything that we do in the meantime to keep progress moving, or do we stop the entire thing and then direct it, or just stop it? Because sometimes when we have a lot of these discussions and we halt everything, then nothing comes of it.
Are you talking about halting research on, are you talking about, when you're talking about stopping everything, are you talking about stopping?
If we just stop geoengineering. Is that, I guess.
So should we just stop research on geoengineering until we work these issues out? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, or should we just go a completely different direction with it?
Well, I think Kyle was suggesting that we should not move forward, right, until we work some of these issues out. I'm inclined to say that he can obviously elaborate on his position. I mean, I think I'm inclined to say that there are different ways of geoengineering, and that we might consider them, the various strategies that are being proposed, on a kind of case-by-case basis. I also tend to think that there are some forms of carbon dioxide removal that have associated with them different kinds of concerns, and maybe than solar radiation management. I think one of the advantages of sort of CDR, carbon dioxide removal, as a broad category is that it does actually take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, which SRM doesn't do. Nevertheless, I mean, I think there are some serious, I mean, I think the worry that, at least one of the worries that I was expressing, that I think people aren't, that some people who are working on this aren't really aware of, is that it may not be received well for, say, the United States and a small coalition of allies to just go ahead and start geoengineering the planet. Some of the consequences, I don't think that the discussion and discourse thus far is taking the social dimensions of geoengineering as seriously as it needs to, or the ethical dimensions for that matter. And there have been, I mean, there's been work here at University of Montana. There have been other studies showing that when you talk to people, not just the scientists, but you talk to people, sort of everyday people in different parts of the world, there are some serious concern. So what I think we should be doing, I guess, is doing our best to move forward with strategies like mitigation, and then if we're going to move forward with a conversation surrounding geoengineering, to do that in an inclusive way, and not to assume that, not to take the view that a kind of paternalistic view on the part of scientists that they can come up with the solutions and then just implement them without bothering to think about the way in which they intersect with broader social processes.
One of the arguments that some of those who advocate for geoengineering research have offered is that if you do the research, you can find out what doesn't work, and that will prevent you sort of hanging on to a false hope. So that's a different kind of argument for doing research, and whether that's an argument that has some subterfuge in it or not, I don't know.
I just wanted to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to address what the folks in the back was saying. Yeah, I mean, I am in line with what you all are saying. I mean, myself and lots of other Native people, it's not really a choice, actually, but we have devoted our lives to doing that kind of work. And I appreciate the idea that just because you acknowledge that it's as bad as it is, that doesn't commit you to geoengineering. I mean, I know in the question that isn't your view, you discussed that in one way of talking about it, where somebody would say that it was inevitable, but in reality, right, that's not an inevitability. And I think one of the things that people forget is that, even on the small budgets that Indigenous people have already amassed a very large climate change movement. So if you were to make an analogy between people with much more resources than Native people have globally, if Native people had the kind of resources that other groups have, imagine the size of that global movement. So that's one thing to think about. Another thing is talking about, okay, well, yeah, a lot of non-Native folks can have a shift in consciousness too, right? And that's a key ingredient. And one of the things I would say is, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I go to regional, national conferences on Indigenous people and climate change. And one of the big things that come up is, where are the non-native folks at these meetings? Why don't they sacrifice to come to the meetings? I mean, some do, but where are the folks that are in it for the long term? So one of the things I worry about is, for a lot of non-native folks, is our folks in it for the long run? Is it just a fad? Is it a 5-year, a 10-year thing, and then one goes back to one's privilege? Or is it a long-term sort of thing? And there's a lot of social learning there too, in terms of how Native, Indigenous, non-Indigenous allies would work together. I think that's a key project. I think that's what you're bringing up. So I do like the points that you all were raising, and think that that's a basis for further conversation.
Let's have it.
Yeah, let's do it right now.
All right, we're out of time. Thanks for coming out tonight, everybody, and thanks to Marion and Carl for coming up to Missoula for this.